The next panel, I think, is going to be a fascinating conversation because right now, protecting digital assets has become a high priority consideration, or more than a high priority consideration for investors. So I'm looking forward to the ground that this panel covers. Let's please welcome to the stage Lauren Abershine, Head of America's Institutional Sales at Coinbase, this year's Diamond sponsor, Yuri Azanov, Head of Trading at Anchorage Digital, Adam Sporn, Managing Director at BitGo, and Sarah Schroeder, Portfolio Manager at One River Digital. Facilitating this conversation will be the Deputy CEO of AIMA, Yuri Kroll. Please welcome them to the stage.
Good afternoon, everybody. As they say, now for something completely different. Digital assets custody, an extremely exciting topic, and I'm not joking, because 5 years ago when we started to look at digital assets in our association, we asked the traditional hedge funds, when are you going to start putting digital assets and trading digital assets in your funds? We knew there was a lot of personal interest amongst the traders, the portfolio managers, but the simple answer we always got was nowhere near now because we have to solve the custody problem. So I was trying to figure out what the custody problem was because at that time I already had some digital assets. Was what? It's solved, no? Fast forward 5 years and we now have the solutions to the custody problem sitting on our panel today. And I'm going to discuss how custody is evolved, how it's serving the institutional clientele, how it is a key piece. And for anybody who's not been living under a rock, they'll understand that indeed asset protection is paramount for all clients. And also address some of the technology solutions that are out there and the extent to which they may or may not drive some of the choices the managers and the users of those solutions make. But I'll maybe start off with, we had some brief introductions, but start off with the panelists telling us a little bit more about their background. So maybe starting with you, Lauren.
Sure. I'm Lauren Abenschein. I look after the Americas institutional sales team at Coinbase, where I've been for the last 4.5 years. My background is in prime brokerage. Coinbase, of course, the largest publicly listed crypto company covering retail, developer, and institutional audiences through our suite of products.
Adam?
Great. Good to see everyone. Adam Sporn. I run BitGo's prime brokerage and U.S. institutional sales. BitGo is a qualified, regulated, insured custodian. We've been in the business for 10 years, have over 1,500 institutional clients. I joined BitGo last year after 20 years in traditional finance, focusing on prime brokerage securities lending at Morgan Stanley, BNY Mellon, and State Street. Looking forward to today's discussion.
Yuri?
Yeah, hello everybody. My name is Yuri. I work at Anchorage Digital, and Anchorage Digital is an institutional-only platform that provides secure and regulated custody, trading, as well as an infrastructure to help clients access all sorts of blockchain-native activities. We are also the first and only federally regulated and chartered OCC bank that's a native digital company.
And Sarah?
Hi everyone, I'm Sarah Schroeder. I'm not from a custodian. I work at One River Asset Management that got into digital assets in 2020, and I run a systematic trend following strategy trading liquid tokens. So these custodians over here are counterparties for my company and for my strategy.
Excellent. So Sarah, why don't you start us off and explain to us why we're having this panel? Why is custody of digital assets different, and how is it different from traditional securities or record keeping for derivatives and so forth? And how does that matter for you in terms of how you execute your strategies?
Sure. So I think it's really important to remember that custody is really an asset security issue. And when we think about custody in traditional markets, it's certainly better understood than it is in digital markets. And there's technological reasons for why that's the case. When we're talking about crypto or digital assets, there's no tangible asset to maintain custody or ownership of. We're talking about something that's inherently intangible. And even more complicated, because we're ultimately talking about blockchains, these are records of transactions. There's not even specifically an asset that you own. The assets that you own are really the accumulation of your transactions. So when we're talking about crypto security and custody, ultimately what we're talking about is the security around your private keys that are used to authorize transactions. It's ultimately transaction security that matters here. That's extremely sensitive in this asset class because there is no intermediary that is ultimately kind of authorizing or unwinding your transactions once they've taken effect. So maintaining good security around the authorization of that transaction process is of the utmost importance to preserving the asset integrity. So ultimately, that's what we're talking about here. We're talking about technological solutions for providing security around your private keys or your transaction signature effectively.
Because if you don't have the keys or someone has them.
No keys, no crypto.
Indeed, or somebody else has got the crypto and you can't call up your custodian and say, hey, that was mine 2 days ago, but I would like it back.
Yeah, unfortunately, it doesn't quite work that way. And you know, there are lots and lots of folks that have felt the adverse effect of this, not just last year, but in kind of crypto's history. We've seen, you know, hacks be a unfortunately frequent occurrence, and frauds have certainly come to light as well. Having good key security and good custodial solutions don't insulate you entirely from all potential malicious acts, but is a really important layer to insulating you from some of those risks.
And could you maybe talk about your strategies and the extent to which they drive the choice of custodians and how they provide the various solutions, especially technology-wise?
Yeah, absolutely. So, you know, this is broader than a custodial question. Ultimately, this is a counterparty question. Having good counterparties in traditional finance is a bit easier in the sense that your counterparties there are large, regulated, national or international organizations. It's very easy to call up Goldman Sachs, for example, and say that you'd like to kind of arrange a swap with them. So when you're in the derivatives market, the counterparties are well known, are heavily regulated, and you have kind of a good, secure path forward there. In digital, we're new in that process and in the life cycle. And so while these folks here on stage have gone to great efforts to secure state charters or federal charters to ensure that they are holding themselves to a regulatory standard and maintaining good technology solutions towards implementing their custody, that is a kind of new understanding and a new evolution. When it comes to strategy design, choosing the counterparties that you work with is ultimately going to be a little bit dependent in part on what kind of strategy you're trying to express. So if you are thinking about a market neutral arbitrage type strategy, for example, you almost inherently need to participate with a lot of counterparties. You need to have assets transacting on multiple exchanges to take advantage of the arbitrage opportunities where they materialize. That does inherently expose you to a fair amount of counterparty risk, and then trying to find ways to insulate yourself from that can be quite challenging today. So the strategy that I run at One River is a systematic trend strategy. It's purely directional. And one of the main advantages of that, in part, is a little more selectivity around the counterparties that we work with. Because we're taking directional token exposure, we can choose the exchanges that we transact on. We have a fair number of choices, and we can kind of alleviate having to have asset exposure to counterparties that might pose perhaps more risk, are certainly less regulated, and we can kind of narrow our focus group to those where we have the highest confidence. So, you know, choosing counterparties that give you confidence is really important, but remembering to think about choosing strategies and asset managers that can kind of narrow your risk spectrum a bit is another really important point towards thinking about how do you participate in digital without taking on a disproportionate amount of risk that can be quite hard to understand, frankly.
Great. So Yuri, let's delve a little deeper into the various technological solutions that are out there. And can you maybe highlight, is it a choice between a sort of a petrol and diesel car, or is it more of a choice of driving a bus or riding a bus or a train? What do people need to think about when considering the various solutions that are out there?
Yep. So there are several well-established solutions in the market right now as far as how to custody your digital assets. But let me build on something Sarah said, which is, not your keys, not your coins. What does that really mean, right? So the private key is what needs to be kept secure in the crypto environment, right? And you can think of a private key as probably the most basic way to think about it is like a password. Like you have to sign this password in order to move your assets outside of your, let's say, your wallet. Right? So whenever you send a transaction outside of your wallet, the validator will see that the private key has signed this transaction, but it doesn't need to see the actual private key. So we believe that the most secure way that offers the lowest surface vulnerability is to keep these private keys completely offline. So we have a specially designed hardware that stays offline and keeps these keys secure, and these keys never go online, right? And then on top of that, you can build different layers of security. So let me just go over, a couple of things that we use at Anchorage. Number one, biometrics. So for every time you want to initiate a transaction, you have to submit, let's say, voice recognition, face recognition, geolocation, and several other ways into our intricate biometric system. So that's one way, right? The second way is the cloud layer. So we have a lot of infrastructure within the cloud where we can see malicious attacks in that layer before they can ever reach the actual hardware where the private keys are stored, right? Third, we have a 24/7 team that reviews any transaction that were initiated where there may be some sorts of anomalies, right? And then finally, another layer that I think is really important is that our security engineers, the way they write code, an analogy I'd like to make, everybody here has probably participated in a process where you're negotiating a legal agreement, right? So what lawyers usually do, they'll look at all the edge cases and they'll, write stuff to, protect you from all these 0.001% chance of like these edge cases happening, right? And that's exactly how we approach writing our security code with the same exact mantra, right? We study all the newest ways that hackers can attack the system and write the code for those very small scenarios. So in summary, private keys offline and then layer on top of that other security protocols.
Adam, Lauren, what have you got to add in terms of what you're seeing and what you're doing yourself?
Yeah, so from a BitGo perspective, our cold storage solution, I think one of the things that Yuri did mention that from a BitGo perspective is we shard those keys, we hold them in grade 3 bank vaults, and that's how we reconstitute the keys. So it's just an added layer of security. Something that also differentiates us from others is we also have cold storage and hot wallets. So we consider BitGo the wallet company. So depending on the solution, we'll determine and the type of client, whether it's cold storage, a hot wallet, or a combination of both. I say VCs, RIAs, our family office clients, they tend to have cold storage solutions. Our crypto native funds, they don't care about the cold storage. In many cases, it's the hot wallets. And then we have a lot of combination of clients that have a combination of both. It could be holding 98% in cold storage for the greatest security, and then taking 2% in hot wallets for your ongoing liquidity needs. So that's where, through our sales and onboarding process, we work with our clients to design the best solution for each client.
Yeah, it's funny you made the comment, is it a train? Is it a diesel car? Is it, and I think for maybe a lot of folks in the audience, the temptation is to say, like, you're talking about these digital bearer assets and it's really complicated. Like, it sounds like this technology has to be like a hover car. Like, this is going to be, really, really complex. The reality is, I think if you do this well, what you're ideally drawing on is not novelty, but rather cryptographic primitives that have been hacked against for decades. So at Coinbase, what we've thought about is really starting from that place. What is time tested that we can use in this novel application? And that's really formed the basis for our cold storage. Of course, we also have hot storage capabilities as well. And when we think about those storage capabilities, we use a variety of techniques. We use multi-party computation, we use sharding, we use hardware security modules, but we really endeavor to go back to that first principle of how do we keep this time-tested, simple and executable. And then of course, a critical part of this entire stack is not just the technology, but as my fellow panelists have highlighted, enterprise security and the sort of permissioning process that allows access to these systems in the first place.
So that's a great segue to how does one think about selecting a custodian, given that now we've mastered the technology. What are the other elements that you need to be mindful of that may not be quite the same, or that may be very similar in terms of, let's say, cybersecurity or operational resilience? Can you talk about the due diligence process and what investors should have in mind when looking at different custodians?
Yeah, absolutely, and happy to start with some of the items that are going to be similar across all asset classes. Certainly things like controls, SOC 1 Type 2, SOC 2 Type 2, having those well evidenced, working with a reputable auditor for that process. Financial health, having that continuity and strength of the business to support the custodian. Asset protection, starts from a foundation of security, but also things like insurance, critically important in crypto, but also in other asset classes, as well as, again, that balance sheet coming into play. And then the management team. We saw this with FTX, not having proper experienced individuals, particularly in control functions, and well-documented history of separation of duties across those control functions. It applies to crypto very much as it does to every other industry. But then some of the things that are maybe a little bit more unique to crypto, obviously the technology itself, we just went through some of those key features, but let's just call it sort of future-proofing. The ability of a custodian to look forward and say, what are the future developments and how flexible is that custodian in being able to adapt to that future? If you thought about what it looked like to hire a custodian a couple of years ago, for the most part, it was, let me get into Bitcoin and ETH, and if I'm a VC or somebody a little bit more adventuresome, I'm going to go for a broader array of tokens. But like if Bitcoin and ETH, you'd kind of get it done. Now ETH is proof of stake. So having to go from proof of work to being able to sign transactions in proof of stake out of safe cold storage or offline storage is a real challenge. And so you need custodians to be able to come along that curve and have the flexibility to advance with the crypto space. And that could include things like delegation, voting, and interaction with DeFi. And then finally, integration. We talked a lot, Sarah talked a lot about some of the operational risks that are inherent in this space. And that means that integration becomes really important. How is your custodian integrated with external systems as well as internal systems to reduce operational risk and increase efficiency?
Right, so a lot of the times, managers mention the ability or inability of custodians to be able to onboard different tokens, different assets, and the speed at which they were able to do that. What's the process here for you guys? What is it led by? Is it the client? Is it sometimes the issuer of the asset? How does that work?
Happy to start.
Yep.
We think about really serving the needs of our protocol clients and our investor clients, and of course corporate clients sort of across the board where we see demand. And so we really want to add the assets that matter most to our clients, and I'm sure that's the case for anybody in this industry, but also put security, compliance, regulation first and foremost.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I'd say it's similar for us. L1s are going to be a longer process. ERC20 tokens, it's getting feedback from our clients on what they're looking at, when their distributions are, and making sure that that we can spin it up prior to them getting that distribution. So.
I think that when doing your due diligence, you just have to make sure that the custodian does have a wide breadth of assets. For example, I think right now at Anchorage we have something like around 200 assets that we support. We've held, I think, which was a record at the time, one of the biggest on-chain votes with the Maker protocol. And then it's really important to also see what are the intercompany agreements like. dig into that, right? And as well as like what other businesses, are there principal businesses inside of the custodian, right? Probably a good idea for there not to be. And then as well, one of the things Anchorage is working on is that we're looking to become a settlement and clearing layer for exchange trading as well, so that you don't have to pre-fund coins on specific exchanges. You can keep it on Anchorage and then do your trading on exchanges. Then Anchorage will be behind the scenes doing all the settlement for you. So I think just a segregation of responsibilities, I think, is a good way to put it, is something that you should really take a deep dive into, besides obviously everything Adam and Lauren already mentioned when doing due diligence on the custodian.
So let's touch on FTX, and one, lessons learned, and two, what other market developments that have been spurred by that? Are clients demanding more custody, or are they self-custodying all of a sudden? A lot of the asset managers who are regulated obviously can't. What's your sense there, Adam?
Yeah, so I think number one lesson is understand with your counterparty where those assets are being held. If you look at the old management of FTX, they were hesitant to add a custodian. We now know why. And frankly, some of the fraud and fractional reserves probably wouldn't be possible if they were using a custodian. And yet the new management of FTX came in, and the first thing that they did is said that they need to protect client assets. They need to move assets as they were seeing some outflows, some hacking. They needed to find someone to protect their assets, and they selected BitGo as custodian for those assets. So we are working with John Ray and the new team throughout bankruptcy. So again, I think that's key is understanding where your counterparty is, where those assets being held. Is it a bankruptcy remote entity? Two is about market structure going forward. And I think some of the things that you see in traditional finance have to come into digital assets. So in traditional finance, you wouldn't leave assets on an exchange. And we think that a better market structure is to separate custody from the exchange. So similar to what Yuri mentioned, BitGo network, we launched that. We announced that pre-FTX. We're seeing a lot of demand in the market for institutions, for LPs to trade directly with exchanges without having to pre-fund and move assets to exchange. So we do think that that's how that leads to a better market structure. Additionally, we're seeing a lot of demand for tri-party. You think in traditional finance, firms take their unencumbered longs, move it to BNY Mellon or others for tri-party. We're seeing, it seems like every day, having 3-4 calls with similar types of inquiries from clients that to sign an account control agreement, open a tri-party, and segregate their trading activity from that firm so that they have better asset protection.
And segregation of assets, let me build on that a little bit more. When you put your assets, let's say with FTX, everything went in one big pool, right? It's important for you to see where your assets actually are. Just as an example, when you have assets at Anchorage, not only can you see it, in your Anchorage software, but you can actually take your address, put it into the public, etherscan.io website, which is, the block explorer, and you can actually see your assets all right there. And they're completely segregated. They're not mixed with anybody else. And you can make sure that, all your assets are safe and secure. So segregation of assets, I think, is really important. Being able to check that on your own without necessarily, using a third party. But then the third party audits are incredibly important as well. So.
Sarah, are there any changes that you guys are pushing yourselves or would like to see?
Look, at One River, we were very selective and narrow about the counterparties we started working with from the get-go, and that served us quite well last year, frankly. And I think that just underscores how important it is to bring a kind of very strong approach to due diligence in the digital space. That's not a secret, and that's true in traditional finance as well. But I think it's also equally important to remember that just because the technological solutions and the counterparties and the assets look different here, doesn't mean your mindset has to be entirely different. The ability and willingness to ask questions, to engage with your prospective counterparties, and to be very frank about when you don't understand something and push on that is so important, not just for the self-education, but also to see how is your counterparty responding to your questions. If you're planning to enter a business relationship with them, that is ultimately going to be a partnership. So what does that partnership look like from the get-go? That's very telling, frankly. And to your point about kind of FTX not wanting to work with some custodians, when you're not getting answers to the questions that you're posing, that's very illuminating as well. So I think the events of last year for me are just a reminder of what good process looks like always. That's not new and that's not specific to these events or the post-FTX world. That's always been true, but this was a brutal reminder for a lot of folks that really we do need to bring that level of inquisitiveness and willingness to kind of put ourselves in front of someone where you may be less educated, but let them help educate you. And if they're not willing to educate you about their processes, that should be throwing up a red flag, frankly. So for us, it's a little bit kind of business as usual, but I think that's because we were relatively conservative and tried very intentionally to be thoughtful about these processes from the very beginning. Where you're seeing more adjustments and course corrections are the folks that were eager to run into the digital space. And the growth in the industry and in the asset pricing has been pretty tremendous, setting aside last year. So the kind of FOMO and the desire to participate and move quickly is very prevalent and entirely understandable. But if you're running too quickly, you can sometimes trip and fall. And so I think this is kind of a reminder that the desire to move quickly needs to be counterbalanced against at what cost that may come. So find the speed that is accommodative to your needs and lets you participate with confidence, frankly.
I guess I'd add one, maybe footnote, sort of lesson learned here, which I really do hope is something that's well internalized. We need regulation. I mean, we need regulatory clarity here. And resoundingly, if you look through the entirety of what's happened here, clearer regulation that gives a pathway for investors onshore, for corporates onshore, for retail is critically important. And if we can take away anything here, I truly hope it's that.
And just one more thing on the FTX, just to build on what Lauren said regulatorily, because of FTX, I think the regulators are actually going to be speeding up their timeline on actually putting regulations forth. So if we think about it, right, Senator Brown is working with a Senate Banking Committee to put a bill forward, right? Rep. McHenry with the Financial Services Committee putting a bill forward, right, as well as looking at a stablecoin bill. And then the Gillibrand-Lummis bill is also probably going to gain some traction. So I think FTX has really accelerated these things. And then, as crypto folk, we're kind of used to the gray area, and I think it's going to become a lot more dark going forward, which we're very happy about.
Well, let's see how quickly Congress can get acting and actually producing something that's constructive to the industry. But as you said, there are several streams there, a discussion that's been ongoing for years now. And the desire and the need to have clarity and have some level of infrastructure at the legal level that provides people the peace of mind that they're not operating in gray areas. And we've been hopefully contributing to that discussion as an organization and our members alongside that. So hopefully we'll get something done this year, but I'm not holding my breath, knowing how complicated the process can be sometimes. So I believe we're out of time. I'll thank my panelists. The lesson is move at a deliberate speed and definitely leave no stone unturned when looking at the custody solutions and the providers out there. The good news is that they're there now, and a lot of them are institutional grade. And if you want a guide to that space, we have actually published a paper in collaboration with many of the institutions who sit here, which you can freely download from our website. So a quick plug to ama.org. Thank you very much.
Thank you.